Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this webinar, and I'm Julie Anne Genter. Before I begin with a formal opening karakia, I just wanted to explain the Zoom webinar format. So this means you'll only be able to see us and the panelists once we bring them on. Feel free to fill in the poll on your screen if it's showing for you, to let us know what part of the country you're calling from, how many people are watching with you, and whether this is your first Green Party Zoom webinar. Feel free to use the chat function for any comments or questions, and we'll do our best to get to some of those at the end. The chat function is at the bottom of the screen in the middle. We're also live streaming this event to Facebook for others to watch there, and we'll post the link in the chat. As I said before, I'm Julie Anne Genter, Green Party MP and spokesperson for Auckland issues, health, transport, urban development, and women. And thank you so much for joining us tonight to discuss kids in the city, transforming our urban spaces. So I'll open up with the karakia now. Kia tau te rangi marie, o te rangi e tūne, o papatuanuku e takotone, o te taio e awhine, ki runga I a tatou, tihe moriora. May the peace of the sky above, of the earth below, and the world all around rest upon us. So that you're aware of what's happening tonight, I'll start by giving a very brief update on what the Greens are working on in government and what we think needs to change. Then we'll hear from each of our fabulous panelists about their organization, how they see the world, and the key things they think need to change. I'll do a bit of a free flow discussion with our panelists on some of the issues around transforming our urban spaces to better meet the needs of all of our residents, particularly women and children. And then we'll be answering some of your questions. Toward the end, we'll spend some time thinking ahead about how our urban spaces can be more resilient and more inclusive. And I think we might have some poll results. I'll do a bit of a free flow discussion with our panelists. Nearly 90 people around transforming tuning in within the Zoom webinar chat, and then there'll be more people from Facebook. We've got quite a few from Canterbury. We've got quite a few from Wellington, and probably more people from Auckland than anywhere else, which isn't too surprising. And a few people even tuning in from overseas. So fantastic to have you all with us here. Now, here's what I've been thinking about urban spaces. I mean, before I got into politics, I trained to be an urban planner, and I ended up focusing a lot on transportation. But my interest in the subject goes way back to when I was growing up in car-dependent Southern California. And I was really curious about why the place I was growing up, which had a stunning climate, beautiful ocean, but it felt really empty and disconnected to me, especially as someone who wasn't old enough to drive. I had to rely on my parents to drive me to school. At a certain age, I managed to work out the very infrequent and unpredictable buses. But generally, you didn't see many people walking around on the streets. Definitely very few people cycling if it was anywhere away from the ocean. And it was just hard to find people unless you went somewhere like a mall. So over time, I started to compare it with other places I saw, places in Europe, Manhattan, or when I came to New Zealand, there are places that are very walkable, where kids still walk and cycle a bit. But then there are places that are incredibly car dependent. And in those places that are more car dependent, we know that there's higher carbon emissions, which is contributing to climate change. In some places, there's declining levels of physical activity amongst kids, and that's correlated with all sorts of long-term health challenges. It's more expensive to have to own a car and use it to get everywhere. So people on lower incomes tend to be more excluded from having the same opportunities as people who have a lot of money and can afford to own cars, drive them, pay for parking. So the work I've been doing in government includes supporting councils and communities to make the choices that serve them better. because for about 50 years, transportation planning was really dominated by cars and oriented around that. Since we've been in government, we've managed to take those first steps on improving things for communities. We've massively increased the funding for bikes in schools and the Bike Ready program, which means that kids who might have a bike at home have access to a track where they can learn to ride safely. They have access to a bike and a helmet and even some skills training. We've focused on making money available for more separated cycleways, which is better for pedestrians and better for people who want to use bikes and scooters and other vehicles that are faster than walking, but need to be separated from fast-moving cars and trucks. We've supported a more community-oriented approach to safer speeds, especially supporting there to be safe speed limits around schools. Although that is only just starting to roll out, we had to change the regulatory and legislative framework first. And we've increased the amount of money that's available to public transport, but we know that we need to go further and faster. You know, in that level 4 lockdown of COVID-19, we briefly got a glimpse of what our neighborhoods could be like when they weren't dominated by traffic. And in many parts of the country, we saw more families getting out on bikes, enjoying the space. We could hear the bird song. It was really quiet in our neighborhoods, and yet we felt more connected to the people around us. While there were many challenges associated with that lockdown, and we certainly don't want to go back to that, we can take that brief glimpse of what our communities could be like and design our transportation system in a way that supports more people-oriented communities where kids finally have the freedom to get around on their own as they once did. So we know there's a lot more to do. Thinking ahead, the Greens want every child to have that opportunity to bike to school and be independent. We want safe speed limits that go beyond schools to residential neighborhoods. And we just want increased investment in the ways of getting around that don't currently exist, that don't exist to the extent that they should. So plentiful, safe, separated cycling infrastructure. I'm going to start to bring our panelists in, and we're going to ask each of you to introduce yourself and your world and share with us some of the key things that you think needs to change. So the first panelist is Emma McInnes, co-founder of Women in Urbanism Aotearoa.
Kia ora, Julie. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, no tamaki makaru aho, ko Emma toku ingoa. So yes, I'm Emma. I'm a co-founder, a very proud one, of Women in Urbanism Aotearoa. Originally, I'm actually from Whananaki, Marua Valley, which is northeast of Whangarei. It's a small town very close to the coast, and I grew up on a beef farm there, and I grew up riding horses primarily. And it was a very isolated coastal part of the country where it was very car dependent. And so I did get everywhere by car. And then I came to the city and studied here in Tamaki. And I've been here for 10 years. And it was really when I began to fall in love with the idea of like walkable places, being connected, having access to all the things that I really need. And while I still very much love my farm, and it's a very big part of me, cities are really where I found that I had more opportunity because I had more access to the things I need to people to support. And that's really where my passion for urbanism started, along with advocacy that I was part of Generation Zero. I worked for it for about 5 years, and that's where I really fell in love with transport and became a climate activist. But when you join a group like that, even though Generation Zero is fantastic, and you start hearing about transport, and then you really realize how equity comes into it. And you know, transport is a very heavily male-dominated industry, and as a consequence of that, our cities' transport infrastructure and housing has really been designed by and for men. And this has sort of been going on like since the inception of cities. Like Aristotle and Plato used to run this thing like a polis, where they would consult on like local government issues essentially, but you weren't invited to participate in the polis if you were a slave or if you were a woman. So since the inception of cities, it's been like that. And then we had the era of like modernism and Fordism, where it became heavily auto-dominated. We designed around the car, and we've neglected to think of the ways that women use cities. And you can really see that in transport infrastructure in particular, where a lot of our public transport, the thing that women actually use more and men use less, is designed for the 9 to 5 commute, rather than all the crosstown trips and trip chaining, which is what women generally do a bit more of. They, rather than going from home to work, they tend to maneuver across the city, or they stop off at their grocery store, or they drop the kids at school, and they do have a lot more complex trips, and we don't really design transport systems around that. Yet public transport is a thing that women predominantly use. And it's the same with our footpaths. Women walk more than men, yet we have a terrible footpath network and a pretty outstanding roading network. And so roads get much more investment than things like walking. And when it comes to cycling, we actually know that women would cycle more than men, and they do so in cities like Amsterdam and in Copenhagen, but you have to have the infrastructure there. It has to be safe for them to do so. So these modes that women prefer or are taking are underinvested in, while the modes that men are mostly taking are overinvested in. So those are some of the issues that really sort of helped us form Women in Urbanism, and we really sort of came about 3 years ago. I co-founded the group with my colleague Abby Granberry, and it's because we saw a real gap in our industries, the urban industries being urban design, urban planning, architecture, engineering, where there's not enough women, there's not enough diversity generally, and that's having poor outcomes for our towns and our cities. And so since then, we've been riding a wave, doing lots of events, trying to empower women to step into the urban industries, as well as to women in the community to even talk about and engage with urban issues. For example, our group is full of nurses and full of teachers who understand the potential of cities, understand that a child being able to walk to school safely is hugely important to that community and to that child. And so we've really built this massive network, and have since then been trying to, I guess, broaden our appeal. So I don't know, I've probably taken up my 3 minutes. You can, maybe I'll talk more as the panel goes on.
Thank you so much, Emma. And what I love about Women in Urbanism is that it's kind of joining that professional background and being a professional support group for women, but it's also kind of reaching into the advocacy space where you can use your professional expertise and match that up with values, but try to change the discourse around why things are the way they are. And I guess I really understand and, admire how good you've been at presenting these issues in a way that helps people see that maybe the barriers are not what we thought, that things could be different, and that if things have ended up in this way that isn't very friendly to kids in particular, that sees kids less likely to walk and cycle to school as they have in the past, it's by design, and we can choose to design it differently. So that brings me to our next speaker, which is Sarah Templeton, who's currently a city councillor in Christchurch, a second-term city councillor, and the chair of the Sustainability and Community Resilience Committee. And local government is so important on this. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, and hi from my backyard office in Christchurch. So I'm a mum of 3. At one point I had 3 under 2, and I never took my kids to town. The old Christchurch CBD was a grey, cold space with kind of narrow footpaths. Always you'd worry about the kids running onto the road, nothing for the kids to do. And it just wasn't a particularly pleasant place. And as every parent who takes small children to town knows, you've got to be able to find a toilet relatively quickly, and you just couldn't do that in the old Christchurch CBD. So I just never took my kids there, and my friends didn't. We'd go to the Botanic Gardens, and that was about it. The earthquakes, however, gave us an amazing opportunity for all the disaster and destruction and loss of life. And while Christchurch had acknowledged previously that we needed to do something, it was it was only through that opportunity that we actually stood up to the challenge and started making a change. So we've got a lot of areas now with wider footpaths. We've got a whole city block dedicated to a free playground, the Margaret Mahi playground, which brings people into town. And it's good for families. Families love it. And it's been really good for the city too. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. And those kind of things that are family friendly, parent friendly, kid friendly do really well for everyone. It was the thing that brought people back and started shopping again in New Regent Street and other kind of places. But it hasn't been easy, and we get a lot of pushback because people wanted the old city. We're used to business as usual, and we're stuck. We were stuck with designs that were from the 40s and 50s that were done by people who had no experience of pushing a buggy or trying to find a toilet with a small child or trying to entertain or keep people's attention. And so our councils have a whole range of amazing sort of urban designers and planners in them now, transport experts who have got fantastic ideas and experience and expertise, and it doesn't always get through. And that's because the people that we elect don't always have the experience and expertise that goes with that. I'm not an urban designer or a planner. I'm a high school teacher in a past life. But also we get pushback from our residents, and our representatives aren't always representative of those communities. So we don't have as many women around the table. We don't have as many young people with children around the table. And that makes a really big difference to the decision making, because unless you have that experience, you can't imagine what it's like and how important it is for that. So what I'd like to see changed is I'd like better representation around the table. I'd like more deliberate engagement with the diverse range of people who use our cities, more engagement with children, and I really want that purple book that we were talking about before this started, which I'm sure we'll hear about. And it's really important that women and children engage in council processes and help give that mandate for the politicians to make the decisions that we know we need to make. When I look at my children and the teenagers now, but the challenges that we face as a city and a nation and as a planet, we need to make these changes. We can't just tinker, we just can't tweak. We need to transform within a really short period of time, within the next decade, transport systems and all of that. And so people need to have their say and get involved.
Thank you so much for that. And, you know, I also think being a woman in local government is incredibly important, because we still don't have 50% representation. And as you point out, the lack of diversity. For our final speaker, I'm really thrilled to introduce Skye Duncan, who will bring a bit of an international perspective. Although she is a New Zealander, she's become a rock star on the global stage of urban design, and it has been the director of the Global Designing Cities Initiative at the National Association of City Transportation Officials in the United States, but working right around the world. Welcome, Skye.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. And thank you so much for having me tonight. It's a real honor and a great treat to be here sharing the evening with all of you to talk about a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about. My name is Skye Duncan. I'm a Kiwi, as Julie mentioned, from Dunedin, and I trained here in Wellington in architecture and worked there for a number of years before I went to the States, where I've been based in New York for the last 15 years now, originally working at the Department of City Planning there, teaching urban design at Columbia University. And then about 5 years ago, I was asked to set up a global arm of a nonprofit over there. And so now I run the Global Designing Cities Initiative at NACTO. And one of our first big tasks at GDCI was this kind of insane role to create a global street design guide, which would, be applicable to Accra and Auckland and from Wellington to, every corner of the world. And so we really looked at how, working with experts around the world, how we could kind of flip that very outdated hierarchical pyramid where the car has been king. All of our kind of highway-like codes have been applied in our cities, and the mission of moving as many cars as possible as quickly has really kind of trumped the role that our cities are for of putting people first. So we kind of invert that pyramid to put people first, with a big focus on pedestrians, particularly elderly, those with disabilities, and of course children as well, which we're talking about tonight. And we understand that a big part of our city is already built, so that it's really critical we get guidance for new environments, but that we also have to kind of go and look at our streets almost like putting on a pair of glasses and asking what's possible of that space in front of us. And so we're thrilled that we've had over 100 cities and organizations now endorse this kind of new approach to urban street design, including 3 cities in New Zealand, which is awesome, Auckland, Wellington, and Dunedin. And then for the last 5 years, we've been working with cities around the world to kind of apply that on the ground, to go from kind of paper to practice, from Brazil, Colombia, Ethiopia, India, Italy, and really looking at how we can help cities see what's possible through transformations, like literally out there painting the streets in the middle of the night, collecting the metrics, to kind of be able to have more of an equitable conversation about this, shifting from kind of anecdote to analysis, but also looking at shifting the longer term policies and building capacities locally. And so what I'm super excited about is that we have recently been working on a new publication called Designing Streets for Kids, which is a supplement to the Global Guide. I've managed to pull up the cover on my iPad, so it's a bit shiny, but it's, and it will be free download, it'll be out there shortly, but it's really looking at the fact that our streets and cities are our largest continuous network of public space. And sadly, devastatingly, they're currently in too many cases essentially supporting these systemic inequities and have essentially become death traps. We're at the point globally where 9 out of 10 people are breathing polluted air, huge cause of which is our vehicles. We have more inactive lifestyles, meaning we've got close to 40 million people who are suffering from chronic disease. We've designed physical activity out of our lives. And we've also got completely preventable deaths on our streets through road traffic fatalities. And it's ridiculous, but globally now, people dying on our streets, it's the #1 killer of ages 5 to 29, completely preventable, #1 killer. So it's completely insane when we think about this. And so, our mission is to really look at, what if instead these spaces can be places for kids and families to grow and learn and play? And what if we designed our cities through the lens of a child, through the lens of we say one of our funders has a program called Urban 95. So what is it like from 95 centimeters to see the city, to move through it? And so what some of the key principles we look at in the guide is, how do we make sure that streets are safe and accessible, right? How do we make sure that we're not killing people, that we're alive, but also how do we start to allow people to thrive, right? How can they be healthy and comfortable so that sidewalks are continuous and plazas have places to sit and rest in the shade, or that a bike lane is protected, so that a caregiver feels comfortable taking the kids and family out cycling, or that a transit stop might be inspiring, and that it's providing reliable and convenient and affordable service. As Emma was mentioning, how women and caregivers move around our cities differently. And of course, also, how can they be, our kind of third principle is, how can they be inspirational and educational? How do they foster love and joy and learning and artwork, and kind of have moments to play along the way in our daily routines? So we're kind of hoping that we can use this as a tool to guide city leaders and technical information to inform practitioners, and also empower communities to go and demand more of the space that are in their front yards in their cities, and to encourage this different perspective of how we design our cities. And we really look at all the different ages and stages. So babies often get forgotten, but it's incredible when we see that a baby's brain makes 1 million new connections every single second. And those connections become stronger through great connections that they have with the relationships with their caregivers, with their environment, with their space. And so we really want to look at what it means, not only for our kind of school kid and our teenagers, but also our babies and the needs of new mothers and new caregivers. Also looking at designing for all modes. So what does it mean to give choices, right? Reliable transit, as we talked about, walking, cycling, rolling, and the infrastructure that's needed in our cities to do that, our footpaths or sidewalks, as we say. And of course, then thinking at different scales. So we have to think of our broader scale of citywide policies, neighborhoods, our land use density and transportation together, and then right down to the block and the detail scale of an accessibility ramp, right? You could get all these perfect things done at the big picture, and if you forget to put in that accessibility ramp, someone in a wheelchair or someone in a stroller can't use that facility. And I can't tell you how many times we see this around the world. So we have, the guide's about to come out. We've also awarded 12 cities around the world with training and technical assistance on this topic. And we've been doing, before lockdown, of course, we were traveling all around the world, you know, literally going out there with bags of rice and strollers and rulers with masks at 95 centimeters, because our engineers and our planners and our designers, they shouldn't just be sitting behind the CAD and the computer screens and the desk. They need to get out there and experience what the noise pollution is like, the speed, how long it takes to cross the street when you have X number of seconds in your traffic signal cycles. So, you know, our hope is that these tools can really help cities to rethink and reimagine these streets through the lens of kids, and that we can do that for kids, but with kids, of course, along the way. And so we touch a bunch on engagement. So yeah, I'll stop there. I could go for hours, but really, really exciting to see this topic brought up and being discussed here in New Zealand, because I think, quite frankly, we've got no excuses here in New Zealand compared to most of the places we work around the world. So I think we, you know, it's a phenomenal opportunity for us to lead the way here and show what's possible.
Thank you so much, Sky and Sarah and Emma. Just a very briefly update on housekeeping. Welcome to anyone who's just turning in. A reminder, we're also streaming this live on Facebook. The link is in the Zoom chat and in the Facebook event, and you're welcome to share it with anyone else who might be interested. You can also send through questions via the chat box in Zoom and on Facebook, and we'll do our best to get to some of those. Right now, I just kind of want to ask all three of you, what do you think is the biggest priority for change? Maybe just start with Sky, just a quick 3 things that we need to happen in order to see this transformation of our streets.
So I would say definitely try and get as many projects on the ground that have metrics with them, because people always say we can't do that here. And the more we have local precedents to point to show that we can, it's very, very helpful for a lot of the naysayers who find this type of transformation really difficult, and that's fair. Change is hard. I would say rethink kind of capacity building, look at who is making these decisions and how do we get those folks out in the city and experiencing the impact of these decisions. Like I said, crossing the street, carrying stuff. What does it mean to get around if you can't afford to drive or you can't afford the petrol? Or you live, you know, in certain parts of the city. And I guess thirdly, I would just act now. I mean, I really think, you know, we don't have any time to waste. I would say look and borrow and steal ideas from other places. It's not about having to be original and reinvent the wheel here. We know this stuff works. We know what doesn't work. We have all the evidence. There's no point in going around and around and doing the same thing. So steal and borrow ideas and let's adapt them and, you know, tweak them to the New Zealand context and then get them on the ground here.
Definitely. And Sarah and Emma, feel free to jump in if you think we haven't mentioned something that needs
yeah, so I think one thing I'd really like to see, and I think we're working on something similar in Christchurch, is a sort of like a binding mode shift target that's specific to a community, like a city or an urban space, and that will really put the pressure on the decision makers to actually get this stuff done. Stuff that I've seen at the moment, some stuff's amazing. Our cycleways network, the stuff that's been done so far, we're seeing a 20% increase year on year over the last 4 years, so 80% in the last 4 years at our 6 key cycle counters on the way into town. So that would be really good, but it is that pushback stuff is really difficult. The funding, I think, is a key one as well. There's never been cheaper to borrow capital at the moment, and getting this stuff done. But I think Sky's right, that capability building in decision makers. I know NZTA started that. There was a webinar during lockdown in lieu of a workshop, and that stuff is really important. And, you know, teaching people and giving them the local data and stuff as well.
Sarah, in Christchurch, since you've done the separated cycleways, there's been a huge increase in women cycling. The percentage has jumped up. Most of New Zealand nationally, it's only about 1 out of 4, 1 out of 3 people using a bicycle to get to work is female. But in Christchurch, that's jumped up to over 40% in the last few years.
Yeah, that's right. And so we've got some really good data on that now. So along those key routes into town for the commuting, we now show 41%, which is fantastic. We've also had a huge increase in some of the schools, the high schools along our cycleways. So we've got data on our cycleways that goes back decades and decades for the school. We've got school bike shed counts that go back to the 70s. And so places like Girls High, which is right on our brand new cycleway, the uni cycle route, because it goes to the university, has had it used to be in the late 60s, early 70s, for the numbers of kids that would bike, girls that would bike to school right through the year. It was down to 5% of students biking in 2016, and it's now up to, girls High's up to 15%. Boys High is close by, and they've gone from 19% to 25% of the students at Boys High now bike to school, and they're on that beautiful new cycle route. And there's others that are doing the same.
Emma, what do you see as a big barrier to implementing the change that we already know we have the evidence for, and that even here in New Zealand, but why isn't it? What do we need to change for it to roll out faster?
Well, actually, I was just going to reflect on a few of the other topics that Sky and Sarah were talking about before I answered that one. So firstly, I was just going to say thank you, Sky, for your excellent NatGeo books, because in my daytime job, I'm an urban designer at Resilio Studio, and I use them like a Bible. I'm constantly there flicking through them. So thank you for all your awesome mahi on those books.
Awesome.
I'm sure they help urban designers and planners globally. And another thing I wanted to talk about, because we talked about some things that we sort of need to make sure that we're able to have the framework there to design cities for women and for children. And one thing that I've been banging on about for years is having some sort of gender mainstreaming program. Now, they had this in Vienna, and it's been around for sort of 20 odd years, sort of founded by Ava Kale, who's the CEO of the city of Vienna. And what it looks at doing is making sure that all projects sort of go through this gender audit to make sure that that projects are designed with gender top of mind. And when you're doing that, you're also thinking of children too. And a good example is like their playgrounds. They did a big sweep of all their playgrounds and did this massive audit of like how children were using parks and playgrounds. And what they found was that actually girls were using them very differently to boys, and often less. And this is because a lot of the time it's due to the equipment. The equipment favors like young boys, and it doesn't really resonate that well with young girls. And you see this a lot here in Aotearoa, where we have sort of like basketball courts, no netball courts. We've got like tons of pump tracks and skate tracks and all this kind of equipment that really is heavily gendered. And so they did this big sweep of their parks and playgrounds and just like really focused on the equipment and made sure that it was a bit more inclusive and included like various forms of equipment that both genders can use, really. And so like off the back of that also, that work that they were doing over there, and we didn't have a gender auditing system here, so we sort of found a local park, Greyland pump track, where we'd noticed this problem was happening, and we just really wanted to prove a point that girls will use those spaces too, but you just have to make it like, so they will still skate and they will still ride their bikes around. You just have to include them in the infrastructure. And we held this event with BMX champ Sarah Walker. It was just for like for 3 hours, and she came out and made this just a girls event, although the boys could definitely join in too. But it was really just about taking back the track and taking back that sense of ownership of space, or feeling like you belong in a space. And, her saying that you belong here, and, having other girls really, having other girls there and other girls interested in the sport really made them all turn out. There was sort of like 40 to 50 young girls there for like 3 hours, and probably one of the worst storms like in years in Auckland. So like, I guess we should be, gender auditing and making sure that our playground equipment is sensitive to all genders, and also making sure that we, I guess, give young girls the confidence to own those spaces as well. And that is something that we can do through a gender auditing program. And that could be at a local government level, or it could be at a central government level. They just run theirs through the city of Vienna. And there's been other like really awesome projects that have come off the back of that, like housing that really focuses on the needs of women, transport that's connected to that housing, that again focuses on, women doing the short trip to the grocery store, really walkable, gridded, dense city centres. So those are just some of the things that I was thinking of as you were talking, Sky, and you were talking, Sarah. And what was the question that you asked me originally, Julie? You asking me what?
Just like a quick thought, like what do you see as the thing that needs to change first to enable the rest of what we know we want to implement? I guess I'm thinking you've all touched upon the issues. It's like what we want, we know what we want in terms of the outcomes. We want places that are good for the planet, that are good for people, where kids can be independent, where there aren't barriers to people because of disability or income or ethnicity or age. And yet it's really hard to move away from the car-centric approach, in part because of technical practice that still occurs, and also because then politically it can be quite difficult. So, I mean, is the biggest barrier political or technical or both?
Top of mind for me is greater diversity within our industry, and I know that's something that is gradually happening, and it's at a very slow rate. But the greater diversity we have around the tables, the more people that understand the importance of a pram ramp because they have pushed a pram before, those things really do matter, and that's why we need greater diversity around those decision-making tables. But what did the others answer that question as well? I'm really keen to hear their thoughts as well.
Oh, one thing I'd really like to see. Is a funding model change, and not through the sort of local government and NZTA stuff, but actually at a much more fundamental level. So what often happens with these projects is that we end up paring down things to the basics, and they're pretty basic with low amenity and those kind of things, because we want to do something, but we want to cut costs. And that comes because the pressure on rates is very vocal, as we're finding at the moment. So central government has all sorts of ways of getting money, and it comes through income tax, through GST, a range of different things, and it can also borrow at a much greater rate and print money. And people don't notice the taxes going. So I think I worked out that about 40% of my income goes in various taxes, whether it's GST or income tax, those kind of things, 45%. And I don't blink an eye, but when the council send me, when I earn the money, it goes into my bank account, and then the council send me a rates demand, I want to count every penny. That's kind of how people look at it. And so there's lots of pushback on rates, which has led over the years to councils sweating assets and going for low amenity solutions and a range of different things to try and cut councils differently. I think that we would find less pushback to the types of designs we need in our city.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think the financial side, has to be addressed. Big infrastructure projects like highways and things are easier to fund, and therefore on paper they look really great and you get a big tick next to it. But actually, and I think it's great what New Zealand's doing with the Innovating Streets program, kind of putting smaller pots of money throughout different sites to show actually, look, you can make change and it can happen pretty quickly. But I do think we have to rethink our budgets and understand what money we're putting where and what we're prioritizing, right? We don't, public transit's another whole huge topic on, around this. Like, we don't expect to make money off our schools and off our libraries, right? We need to, in Europe, often public transport and public space is seen as a public good, right? You just have everybody has a right to that. So thinking about what we're funding obviously makes a huge difference. But I think, Julie, it has to also be, as you alluded to, it has to also be technical and it has to also be political. I think we can't isolate any of them. We have to really kind of approach this from every perspective, because at the moment, how our kind of budgets and our technical documents and many of the policies and financial aspects come together, not just in New Zealand, holistically around the world, essentially is saying that we care more about our cars than we do about our kids. And so therefore it's not surprising when we're getting the types of results and that we've seen for the past few decades. So there's obviously not one magic answer, but I think we do really have to kind of look at where are the impediments that are stopping these things from happening. How do we remove those impediments? And then how do we set a new baseline for a new generation of how great, sustainable, healthy cities are made for the next generation? Because otherwise we're in a lot of trouble, right? We know all the answers and we know what we're doing that's wrong. So when the next generation kind of looks to us and says, well, you knew this, and why did you still keep doing X, Y, and Z? Then we're going to have a lot to answer for. So I think, instead, if we can turn that around and know that we're doing everything we can and essentially flipping that lens, and that's why we do the lens of the kids or the 95 centimeters, is like, think about the city from a different standing point.
Yeah, absolutely. So we need to change the profession and get more diversity around the table. We need to make local government more representative. We need to change the funding models to make sure they're not a barrier. And I've got a provocative question here from Alex Dyer to all the panelists. I believe that driving is the new smoking, and that we need to, at least partially, frame the problems they bring in a similar way. Children being driven in cars are exposed to higher levels of air pollution, exactly the same problem as secondhand smoke. This fact is barely recognized by most. How will we transform cities faster for people, and especially kids, without raising the general public's understanding that cars are a major public health issue? Do any of you think that is something that we need maybe to be a little bit more aggressive around raising the problems with really high car dependence? I've always tried to go for the car drivers will be better off if more people can walk and cycle. This is all about choice, but I'm interested in your perspective.
I mean, look, I think there's different approaches depending on the conversation you're in and the scale and the project that you're at that time. But I couldn't agree more that I think this is a huge global health crisis. And this fear of change, when we look at the smoking analogy, and I often use this actually, when we were told suddenly you can't smoke inside, everyone said, there's no way. How do you take away my right to do that? It's my right. It's my health. And who would have thought that in a matter of a pretty short period of time, that has completely been turned on its head. And I totally agree. I think we're going to look back and go, how did we let, I think New Zealand's 330 people die on the streets last year because of the way we designed our street? Like, how did we let that happen? How did we let kids dying on our streets become the number one global way of dying, right? We know how to stop that. So I think we can do it. I think sometimes the kind of urgent, more scary reminder, it is important that we to shake things up. Otherwise we become the frog slowly boiling ourselves to death, where we're going to wake up and go, it's all too late. So yeah, I think it's a pretty helpful analogy.
I'd like to see us change the language we use at times, and I think shaming is probably not a good framing for it with that emotional stuff. But I think that we need to stop talking about the road toll like it's just something that you pay to get in. It's like something that we automatically assume we will have to pay, and we will automatically have to lose lives for the use of our roads.
Wrong place, wrong time.
Yeah,
oh well,
that kind of thing, right? And talking about driver responsibility and those kind of things. I know that. It's really interesting having a look at the comments that happen around both in the media as well about victim blaming and that kind of stuff when it comes to pedestrians and cyclists who get hit by cars. So I think using really accurate language is really important, and not hiding away from the fact that driver behaviour plays a huge part in what happens on our roads. But I think that will be a key start.
Yeah, I also agree with the avoiding shaming people for using private vehicles. Like, yeah, there are many instances where people are just being incredibly lazy and using their car when there is there is an instance where they do have a service by good public transport. But in many cases, like, Auckland well, and in any centre outside of Auckland too, people don't have the choice, and predominantly it's like women that don't have the choice. And so it's like women like are forced to take the car, even though they're more likely to take public transport. But when they're in a position where they've got to cross town, they've got to take the car. They have no other alternative. And so I would really rather that they weren't shamed into doing that, because they're just really trying to do what's best for their kids, get them to school on time, get them to sports or whatever. So yeah, I think it's not like super helpful language. And I always feel really bad when like this happens. Like, quite often people come to me because they know that I cycle all the time, and they apologize to me for driving, and I'm just like, I'm no authority on this. Like, you have to drive your car in because you literally have no other option. I do not want you to feel embarrassed for doing that. It just is like utterly ridiculous. Who should be embarrassed are the people who have not put those systems in place. That's embarrassing. Yeah.
I think, Emma, you're totally right. And rather than being, it's not about being anti-car, it's about being pro-choice. And I think, the reality is that we, as you mentioned, we're not giving people the choice in many cases because we don't give safe spaces to bike or reliable transit. And so, yeah, it's not about saying you can't ever have a car anywhere, but you've got to have alternatives in cities so that people have those choices to make around what's best for them at which time.
And that's the key place where the analogy isn't quite right with the smoking. So the shaming on smoking came after the rules changed on smoking, and after all of that stuff had happened. And there's smoking shaming, and I hardly see people smoking at all now. But that stuff came in after. And so I think that it's hard to shame people when they don't have those options. And I think that the more we give people options, the more some of that subtle societal changes over what the expectations are will be really important. But I think giving people the options is really important to start with.
I've got a few questions in the chat about metrics. One from Boopsie Moran, who says, we've heard of Neighbourlytics in Australia. Do any of the panelists have a preferred quality metric and data tool that's trusted and proven successful here in Aotearoa? And I think there's another question on that same issue, but I can't see the full name of the person who asked it. What metrics are most effective for winning over naysaying decision makers?
Well, I'm just going to say that one of the best things that we've done in Christchurch is have public-facing data. So we've got a Smart View website as part of our Smart Cities program, and I don't know if anyone else has seen it, but we've got all of our cycle counters are up there. So there's a huge range of them, and I know someone mentioned, I was talking about just the commuting stuff earlier, but a huge range from around the city, around our suburban centres and those kind of things. And all of that data is up there, public facing. It's weekly numbers, weekly counts updated daily, and being able to show that information, have it available for decision makers, show it to members of the public when they say, oh, no one bikes in Christchurch. Oh, look, here's today's screenshot. We've got 86,000 people, moved in the last week. Those kind of things. It's been really good.
Sometimes I'm skeptical of that because we have the data there and we know like what would work, and we've also like got lots of really great case studies from overseas, but still things don't happen. And I think it's just like some politicians just want to ignore it. Their constituents think one way, and even if they do see the numbers, they will still pretend like they can't see it. One of the best examples though I saw of like a councillor changing their mind, and this was on the Skypath issue, so the walking and cycling bridge over the harbour bridge, was when I was with Generation Zero and we flooded sort of their resource consent form of submissions, and while they were having like their council meeting on whether like who like that was the vote for Skypath essentially, his phone literally started buzzing and like fell off the table because he was getting so many submissions like from people coming through, and so many emails of angry not necessarily constituents but just people from all over Auckland and Aotearoa who like just couldn't believe that this councillor was going to try and hold it up. So sometimes it's just like, just real pressure, like knocking at their door. But otherwise, like they'll have the numbers in front of them and they'll still ignore it if their constituents won't vote them in again. So I think that's
yeah. And because what you've got is you've got a whole pile of people sitting around the table that are just normal everyday people, and different things help them with different decision making. And one of the things that we found the most powerful during our long-term plan last time was people turning up to make submissions in person and telling their stories. And there was one woman who turned up, Angela, with a baby in a sling, talking about her experience cycling with her baby. And it was so incredibly powerful. But getting people to turn up, tell their stories, is incredibly important.
Yeah, and overwhelmingly older Pākehā people from really rich suburbs in Auckland in particular, and I assume it's the same from around the country, that are the ones who are able to turn up and like have their say. And that's really powerful, that they can be in person and have their say. Like that's the most powerful thing you can do. It's like how you can sway people. But the reality is that people who actually the change affects like can't make it. They need to be at work or they need to be caring for their children. And so it's like, how can you make those online comments, that online consultation count just as much as that in-person consultation? It's really powerful that Mother was able to turn up, but I bet that's not the reality for most mothers, most people with young children, most people in a position where they have to work that day.
Yeah, just to say, if someone, I forget the name, I'm sorry, but asking for tools. So, I mean, we do a lot of work around metrics and evaluation. We do think it's very important. It's not the only thing, but certainly, you need the numbers and the stories. You need the quantitative and qualitative. And because different people make different decisions in different ways. And so the more tools you have to be able to communicate the rationale for the impact of a project, the better. So we do a mixture in the Global Street Design Guide. It's on the website. There's a bunch of kind of metrics you could look at. Feel free to email me. We've got a bunch of kind of old school forms that we use. In many cases, it's pretty non-techie, but pretty effective. But the reality is what we measure mostly at the moment with regards to our streets and transportation is car throughput and speeds. And because we don't measure a lot of the other things, that it's very hard to shift budgets and to shift conversations. So a big starting point for us now, work internationally, is to measure a broader set of users that are in the street and make sure that that surveys, it's qualitative and quantitative. But also to the kind of story side, I can't tell you the number of times we've also taken like the head of a transportation department out onto site and looked and seen and drawn and painted and having them actually experience a different reality is also quite invaluable. So taking them there, taking the meetings to the sites where the schools and caregivers and mothers are there that can come and contribute to that conversation certainly helps to have a fair and more equitable conversation.
Just really quickly, Sky, is there an easy place for people to find like templates for the type of data that you might want to gather?
Yeah, so we should put them online. At the moment, it's got all the templates. So if you go to the globaldesigningscities.org, there's a metrics section that you can have a look at, and feel free to email me. But we've got all the we've got template surveys and ways for folks doing counts. And it's important, I think, to think about the mobility side of it, but also the public space. We haven't even touched on access to nature today, which is another huge topic that we could talk for hours about. That our streets and cities need, obviously. But yeah, so there's some basic forms in there that you can.
We are coming up on 8:30, but if the panelists are all okay, because we still have quite a few questions, I thought we might go for another 10 minutes. And of course, we still have over 90 people within the Zoom chat and more people watching on Facebook. So if everyone's okay, I'll just move on to a very specific question about an announcement today. This is from Joe Murphy. So the cancellation of the huge rail plan for Auckland access to and from the airport, surely the huge cost of that plan will need to be redirected to get New Zealand Inc. going. Support for businesses and extra funding for doctors and hospitals will be huge. Won't some aspirational ideas die a natural death as our priorities change? I might just really quickly speak to that, but I'm interested in feedback from others. What they're referring to is, I know it's being reported as New Zealand first stopping the light rail proposal, but my interpretation of it is quite different, actually. The light rail city centre to Mangere is still a government priority. It was agreed to by all three parties in the government in our government policy statement on transport. It's a priority in the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, which was agreed to by Cabinet. And the Minister of Transport, while he has terminated the two-track process in which he was had different parties proposing a kind of unique approach to building, funding, and financing the rail project, it's reverting back to the original process. So we haven't been able to get agreement with New Zealand First on what the Minister of Transport wanted, but in my view, this is giving us a lot more certainty to move forward with Auckland on what the best options are for rail there. And infrastructure investment is seen as critical to responding to climate change, but also critical to our well-being as a country. And so I don't think it's something that we will move away from. We still have a need to invest in these projects. I'm really keen that Auckland Transport, Auckland Council are at the table and that we get a design that delivers the very best for Auckland. But anyone else is free. Emma, especially as an Aucklander, I don't know if you have any comments.
Sorry, I just had to unmute myself. Yeah, I haven't really had time to digest it today, but I think just LRT is absolutely worth waiting for. It's going to be a real transformational mode for Auckland. So if we have to wait a little bit longer, I definitely think it's worth it.
Yeah, and actually we won't be waiting longer than we would have under the previous national government. That was going to be 37 years. So yeah. It's all right.
But yeah, it really, you know, LRT is a really good enabler of those people-friendly streets. And I can't tell you how many times, like when I was like over in Europe, I saw like it's much more comfortable for children and people with prams and people of all ages and abilities to negotiate when there's light rail around versus something like cars, obviously. So yeah, I just think it is a really fantastic mode. So I can't wait to see where it happens, but I definitely think it's still worth waiting for.
Sky, have you observed light rail, surface light rail versus grade separated metro rail in different cities? And do you have any comments on the merits of those from the perspective of children and women?
Yeah, look, I'm a big fan of many of the places around the world that have managed to kind of embed light rail and tram systems within their cities, particularly where there's very accessible onboarding and offboarding for people of all ages and abilities to access their city. It also, I mean, I know there's a lot of debate around buses versus light rail and the flexibility, but it really does kind of give that level of predictability for, you know, coordination with our kind of land use and density planning for broader investments that are happening in our neighborhoods and cities. And I think as part of a, you know, really can be a wonderful kind of backbone for the mobility choices of a city that can then, of course, get complemented by biking and rolling and walking and car share where needed and things. So yeah, I would say mostly in European cities that I've experienced pretty fabulous examples of that. And I think, you know, we often tell ourselves in New Zealand that we can't do this stuff because we're not big enough and we don't have the population. But you know, in fact, there's actually many smaller cities around the world who manage to prioritize public transit as a public good, as I was mentioning earlier, and those political and financial decisions to build that backbone of the city really just pay off for decades to come. And in the, I mean, it's wonderful environments that can be created. So I'm very hopeful for New Zealand.
I've noticed a lot of comments in the chat talking about nature as well, nature and beauty, and I think all of the panelists have, even Sky, you directly spoke to how we could have a whole other webinar session on the importance of nature in the city and bringing that into urban spaces. Do Sarah or Emma have any comments? Or
You
just that is that actually my mic sensitive? Is this better? Much better? Okay, I wish I'd known earlier. Just that it's so incredibly important that we have that nature space around the place and really close to where people are living, especially as we become more dense in our urban areas, and having those park spaces, those nature spaces, and not all just too formal and lawns clipped and well maintained, because actually what kids like playing in is stuff that's a little bit messy, in creeks and drains and stuff as well. And so allowing space for exploration, not just something that looks pretty, is really important.
Yeah, I would just agree with that. And you especially saw the impacts through COVID of how essential it was that neighborhoods had access to, their local park. And there was a huge gap between those sort of like in the inner isthmus and like, say, places like in Botany, where there's just a complete lack of parks, or even just green spaces with just some activation. Like maybe there'd be a patch of grass, but like, there's nothing really happening there. So parks also need like a little bit of activation to make sure it's inviting, to make sure there's multiple uses, to make sure people will use it. So that does need to happen. At the same time, we have 2 city centre playgrounds for all of Auckland CBD. One is Myers Park, and it's not super well used, and that's because a lot of the housing is backing onto it rather than facing it. So it's actually like, I find it like kind of creepy, and like I think there's been moves by the local board to slowly activate it again, but it's it's one of those places where it's only really active at very certain times, compared to somewhere like Wynyard, which is just activated all the time. It's just a fabulous like playground, and people often like come from quite far away to bring their kids, so it's a bit of a destination playground as well as like a neighborhood one, but that's way too far to walk if you're living in some of the inner city apartments in Auckland City. So there's really like, again, a huge gap in the inner city and sort of like further out of Auckland, I think, of playgrounds and access to nature. One thing I found, like when going through Europe, Oslo is a really great example of this, where you could take the train line right out to a lake and a big bushwalk, and like just to have that opportunity and that access to nature in Auckland would be really fantastic, especially if we're going to think about how we, shift from vehicles to public transport. Like if people don't want to own a car in Auckland City but still want to access nature, then there should be that option for them. You should be able to, take a train out comfortably to Mission Bay, although I know that you can do that by bus, but like there's a few other places like our precious Maunga that should be more accessible by public transport than people having to get in and drive all the time. So yeah, those are just some areas where I think there is really key areas for improvement, especially allowing children access to nature, but also everyone else. And, I think if you design a city that is for children, you're going to design a pretty good city that works really well for everyone as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add, in terms of nature and green infrastructure, I mean, there's just so many benefits of getting more landscape and trees and plants into our streets and our cities. I think, Sarah, your point about density is so critical right now in this global pandemic where so many people are locked inside or, staying close to home. Many places don't have access to parks and playgrounds, right? So looking at strategies to bring nature into the street, it allows us to manage our stormwater better. It helps us clean our air. It helps improve our biodiversity, our mental health, our physical health. It gives us shade, urban heat island effect. The list goes on and on of the benefits of incorporating nature systemically in our streets and in our urban environments. And, with the Streets for Kids work we've been doing, it's also quite fascinating from the early childhood perspective, just the learning that happens through access to nature, through that messiness of nature, the autumn leaves, decomposting on the sidewalks, and the access to, the different shapes and colors of flowers and herbs and smells, all of those human senses that get triggered with our access to nature. So I agree, we could go for hours on just that one topic, but I do think as we're rethinking the role of a lot of our public spaces in our streets and cities, we have to make them not only work for more people, but serve many more functions, because that's a finite space. We don't have unlimited space, and so we have to make it work really, really hard in cities to benefit as many people and functions as possible.
Fantastic. Well, I feel that we could keep talking for ages, but it is 8:40. And I just want to thank each and every panelist and sort of sum up what I've heard. What I've heard is we need to work more collaboratively and collectively to include the needs of everyone who's not been in the dominant group. So that includes women, children, people with varying abilities, physical disabilities, mental challenge disabilities. We need to include people from all different ethnic backgrounds, and especially in Aotearoa, I think a titiriti approach to ensure that tangata whenua are right there at the table. And the way that we get there is that we actually need more people who are passionate about this and who care about this vision to get involved. And whether that is professionally, if you're a young person thinking about studying urban planning or transportation engineering or architecture, all of these could be things that you could get into. But even we need the change sooner. So as we've heard from our local city councillor in Christchurch and from Emma, who as part of Gen Zero helped change the views of politicians by showing up, submitting, campaigning, sending emails to elected representatives to make sure that they are getting the message. I think we need both political leadership at our councils, our local boards. I know there were some other local board members joining the Zoom chat tonight, like Julie Ferry. So standing for office, showing up to submit, tell your story, write to your local paper, and definitely email your local representative. Definitely vote in local body elections and vote in the upcoming central government election on the 19th of September or before, because there will be early voting. And then in addition to this political leadership, we just need to keep pushing the technical solutions that are being developed, like the initiative around Cities for All People, Sky Duncan's work at NECTO. They have these fantastic design guidelines, and so we need to share those with professionals and with politicians to make sure the professionals advising them in council are aware of these guidelines. Is there any final word from our three panelists that you'd like to say? Maybe we'll go in the opposite order to how we started. Sky?
I just say, let's get started. Let's go.
Sarah?
Just get involved wherever you can. Hold your politicians to account and tell them that you want better.
Yeah, ditto that. Also really looking forward to all these tactical urbanism projects coming up in the future. I can tell that so much good thinking and work and is going to spiral out of them, but also just plugging again the idea of gender mainstreaming. This should be something that we should be thinking at a local and central government level. So I don't know if you can get Phil onto that. Yeah, it's being able to our projects to see if they actually work for women and work for children is incredibly important. We need to be measuring that. So yeah, thank you, Julie. Thank you, Sky. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks. I'll just close with a karakia. Tutawa mai ronga, tutawa mai raro, tutawa mai roto, tutawa mai iwaho. Kia to ai te mori tu, te mori ora, ki te katoa, homuye, huye, tai kie. Come forth from above, come forth from below, come forth from within, and from the environment, vitality and well-being for all, strengthened in unity. Thanks, everyone.
Ka kite.